I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to Voices of the First World War. In the years leading up to the centenary of the war, the last of those who actually experienced it passed away. But the Imperial War Museums and the BBC had recorded interviews with many veterans to try to capture what it was like to actually be there. This series listens to those stories.
The bullets were hitting the trees and the objects around us all night, you see. But there was something which I didn't tell you there, which is worthy of putting on record. On the night that I crawled up to find that front line, when I got back about 9:30, I was standing at the head of my ambulances, waiting for my officer to turn up, and up in the tree was a nightingale singing his heart out. Now, if ever there was a bizarre situation, fancy that one. Death going on down below on the ground, spare bullets coming over, knocking against the trees all over, and there was this bird up there singing his heart out in the darkness.
The Allies were determined not to lose Ypres. It was the last scrap of unoccupied Belgium, and any German advance also threatened the all-important Channel ports, through which flowed the men and supplies on which the war effort depended. More recruits were called for. Your country needs you was the enduring message of the campaign led by Lord Kitchener. He wanted initially to raise 500,000 soldiers. Civilian George Cole was a miner at Seaham Colliery in 1914.
I think one of the things that you used to have these different posters, see, and I can say what I say it now. There's a fellow lying wounded, and the other one stand up there with his bandage on his head, and the words was, "Will they never come?" Off I went and joined up on the 20th of January, see.
Throughout 1915, propaganda, poster campaigns, news coming from the front, and peer group pressure all combined to convince a steady flow of young men to enlist. Compulsory conscription would come in 1916, but for now, volunteering was relied upon.
The word Ypres is a difficult word to pronounce to us, so we simply called it Ypres.
In April 1915, a new wave of Territorials arrived at the Western Front. Northumberland Fusiliers. They'd been sent out to complete their training in the area to the west of Ypres. Among them was Lance Corporal Jack Dorgan.
There, in the distance, the sky was lit up and we could see the German shells dropping.
We passed the Cloth Hall. That was being terribly badly damaged with a high explosive. And the cathedral. The cathedral, I believe, when we were going through, was on fire.
Lance Sergeant George Harbottle was part of the same unit. Historian Peter Hart recorded interviews with both George and Jack in 1986.
The 50th Northumbrian Division was a territorial force division that had been called into action from the start of the war. They were ready to go to France, but they were by no means ready to go into action. They would have expected, when they got to France, to go in a prolonged period of training, and they would be assigned to regular units to get used to it, to learn. That's what they'd have expected. But with the German gas attack on the 22nd of April, there was no time for this.
And then on the morning of the 26th of April, orders were received for the whole of the brigade to attack St. Julian. Now, St. Julian was a village about 6 or 8 miles from Ypres, and their guns were shelling the town.
At noon, we got orders to fall in, and we were in full marching order. We didn't know where we were going, but actually we were going in to attack St. Julian. We knew nothing about it, nor did the officers.
These men have had basic training, but they've never heard the crack of rifles. They've never been under shell fire. They've never had that feeling that any moment they could be killed. You need to go through these different layers of training to be a competent, hard-bitten soldier. And these men were nowhere near that at this stage.
Then immediately we started to go forward on that morning of the 26th of April 1915. We came under shell fire. As we went forward, men were being shot down, wounded and killed. I remember one of our sergeants, Sergeant Peck, he lay in the middle of a field shouting for help. swearing and tearing, and you could see that chaps had gone forward to help him because there they were lying dead in the field alongside of him. Yet he still kept shouting and swearing for somebody to help him.
We knew we had to go as far as our own front line. We were a long way behind the front line, you see. There was a great long line of barbed wire about 10 yards wide and about 4 feet high, and there was only a single gap. Most of the 1st and 2nd platoon of A Company got through, and we then could see our own front line down the hill and the German lines on the slope above. And of course, having got through the gap straight away, they hadn't got ranged on us. But then when the rest of the battalion were trying to get through that gap, they got murdered by machine gun fire, artillery fire. We lost, out of the 1,000 that were there, we lost 650 in casualties, largely through that gap.
This barbed wire, there was no way through, but you didn't have anything to cut the wire with?
Well, here was Garton, a brave officer who had wire cutters, and he stood there cutting another gap, and of course was killed.
It was presumably British barbed wire.
Oh, it was our reserve line wire, you see. The thing is that this attack had been ordered just like that. Nobody had had any chance to reconnoiter the place. We didn't know anything about it. You're simply going on blind. It was the most wickedest thing going. And of course, all these fellows, quantities of them, killed for nothing.
Jack Dorgan was slightly further along the line, but soon he too experienced the full horror of war.
I remember we went forward, going forward, and a batch of us, we lay behind a hedge, and we were resting, and a shell dropped right in among us, half a dozen or so. When I pulled myself together, I was lying in the shell hole, and another soldier was there with me, unwounded, same as I was. But the 2 men were in the shell hole along with us, and they were wounded. So we shouted for stretcher bearers to come. And then the other chap says to me, "We're not all here, Jack." I says, "No, we are not." So I climbed out of the shell hole, and there was 2 of our comrades lying just a few yards from the shell hole. They were lying, no, their legs were blown off. All I could see when I climbed up to them was their thigh bones. I can always remember their white thigh bones. The rest of their legs were gone. Private Jackie Oliver was one of them. He never recovered consciousness. I shouted back to the fellas behind me. I says, "Tell Reedy Oliver his brother's been wounded." And Reedy came along, stood looking at his brother, lying there, no legs, and he died a few minutes later. But the other, Private Bob Young, was conscious right to the last. I lay alongside of him. I says, "Can I do anything for you, Bob?" He says, "Straighten my legs, Jack." And he had no legs. I touched the bones, that satisfied him. And then he said, "Get my wife's photograph out of my breast pocket." I took his wife's photograph out, put it in his hands, and he lay there. He couldn't move, couldn't lift a hand, couldn't lift a finger, but he held his wife's photograph on his chest. And that's how Bob Young died. Today, on the Meaden Gate Memorial, their names are recorded as having no known graves. I've seen those names many, many times since the war. When I've stood and looked at them, I sometimes thought my name could have been there as well, because I was in the same shell hole that killed us too. And every time I go to Ypres, I always go along. I stand and look at it. And I think how lucky I am.
The area around Ypres was a crucible of intense fighting. It was becoming the graveyard of the British Expeditionary Force. Back on the front line, both Dorgan and Harbottle finally encountered some battle-hardened regular soldiers.
Our gallant Southern Highlanders and the Hampshires, and they said, well, what the hell's all this about? You see, and they didn't know what we were up to at all. I asked the usual 3 questions would have been trained to ask as soon as you reinforced anywhere. What's the range? Are you short of ammunition? They said, get your head down. He said, never mind about where the enemy are. He said, there's plenty of ammunition there. He kicked a couple of great boxes of ammunition. And they weren't interested. I said, are you coming on? No, she said, we're not mad. This is the regular army, you see. I said, you're crazy. We don't know what you're doing.
You couldn't go forward because you were in the gas-laden atmosphere. So we just came back.
You'd suffered all these casualties, but you hadn't even gone over the British original front line.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. We only got up to these reserve trenches that the Canadians were in. You couldn't go forward.
All that was left was retreat. The whole episode reflects the appalling disconnect between the attacking infantry and the staff to the rear, who were attempting to coordinate vast numbers of men over a huge battlefield based on second- or third-hand information that was hours out of date.
And lines, you could see lines and lines and lines of British soldiers going back with roller bandages around their eyes, going back towards Ypres. Each with a hand on the shoulder of the man in front of them, and that's how we finished that day.
It sounds like somebody somewhere had been extremely incompetent, either the officers within the battalion or at a higher level. Did you attribute blame at the time?
We didn't know what had gone wrong, and I know that our commanding officer got a great deal of blame back here in Newcastle, but it wasn't his fault. He didn't know any more than we did.
On the 27th of April 1915, what was left of the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th Northumberlands, we were paraded in a field and we were addressed by Sir John French, who was commanding officer of the British forces in Flanders at that time. He addressed us and praised us for all bravery and sternness and so on.
What did you think of him?
Nothing. Nothing. Got no thoughts about him. We just thought, well, he's just come from his office somewhere back in the line and praising us up. No, we just accepted it, you see. But we didn't want it rubbed in. That's the attitude we had about him coming there on that day.